Okay, moving on to our next part of this, evaluating expressions and solving for variables. Our first three here, we're just going to be solving for x, rearranging that equation. So I'm going to start here by subtracting a y squared from both sides to get x closer to being by itself. And what I'm going to be left with then is 4 minus y squared equals x squared. Okay, the next step is we're going to take the square root of both sides. Keep in mind that whatever you do to one side, you must do to the entire other side. What that does is it gets our x by itself. On the left side of this equation, I know it's tempting to want to distribute that square root, but you cannot. Okay, you can't turn that into 2 minus y. It must stay the square root of 4 minus y squared. And since right here in this step we took the square root of x squared, we need to put a plus or minus in front of this for it to be a full correct answer. Moving on to our next one here, what I see is I have 9z squared x squared, and I want to again get x closer to being by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides now by 9z squared. Okay, the x squared is multiplied by that, and so what that does is it divides out on this side, and what I am left with then is that x squared equals a squared plus b squared all over the quantity 9z squared. Okay, I'm going to take the square root of both sides yet again, and what I'm going to get then is that x is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of a squared plus b squared over 9z squared. In this case, however, I can, when you have a fraction, you can take that square root and do the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. So I can write this as the square root of a squared plus b squared divided by the square root of 9z squared. And since this all here is multiplied, 9z squared is something we can take the square root of. We can't distribute it to two terms that are added, like we saw in the last problem, but we can take the square root of 9z squared. And so what we get is that x equals plus or minus the square root of a squared plus b squared all over the quantity 3z. Now technically this is not really an incorrect answer, maybe slightly incomplete. The important thing to know is that you can take the square root of that bottom and cannot take the square root of that top. If you left the answer like this or like this, that really is not the end of the world. Moving on to our next problem here, I see I have this square root of x minus y squared under the radical. So what I'm going to do first is, in order to get rid of that, to undo that square root, I'm going to square both sides. And so the one side becomes x minus y squared. The other side is going to be, and I'm not going to bother expanding this, I'm just going to leave it as 6 plus z squared. Although if you expanded it and got 36 plus 12z plus z squared, that would be acceptable. And then on the bottom, okay, I'm going to have the quantity 2w squared. All right. It's important to note that this can become 4w squared. That is okay. This one, if you want to square it, okay, keep in mind that you need to do 6 plus z times 6 plus z. This does not become 36 plus z squared. That is very important. Okay, something to keep in mind here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add y squared to both sides. And what I'm going to be left with then is x equals 6 plus z, the quantity squared, over 4w squared plus y squared. And that is going to be my final answer. Moving on to my next part of this, we're not only going to be solving for x here, but we're also then going to be evaluating these expressions, which is actually slightly easier probably than solving for x. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I see this fraction, and what I'm going to do here with a 0.5j equals lk squared over x is I'm going to turn both sides into a fraction and use what I think is a very useful technique, and that is cross multiplying. When you have two fractions that are equal to each other, this is a good time to cross multiply. So what I end up getting then is 0.5jx equals 1, I'm not going to write that, lk squared. Okay, the next step here to solve for x is I'm going to divide both sides by 0.5j, and what I end up getting then is that x is going to be equal to lk squared divided by 0.5j. A lot of times we don't write decimals on the bottom, so what I can do is multiply top and bottom by 2, and then this turns into the answer given on the sheet, 2lk squared all over j. Once again, though, this is something that I'm not going to nitpick about if you have that left in your answer. The next step now is going to be to evaluate this expression. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute in for L, which I know is equal to 4, for K, which is equal to 2, that quantity is squared, and for J, which is equal to 15, just taking this expression down here and plugging in those quantities, and I find that X in this case is going to have a value of 2.13 depending on how you round it. Moving on to the next one here, I have 1 over x equals 1 over I plus 1 over j. This one is a little bit trickier. You might want to cross multiply here, or think that you can cross multiply, but you actually can't yet. What you need to do to cross multiply is you need a fraction equal to another fraction, and we see over on this side that there are two fractions added together. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn those into a single fraction, and I'm going to do that by finding a least common denominator. So I'm going to multiply this fraction here by j over j, and I'm going to multiply this fraction here by I over I, and what I'm going to get now is that 1 over x is equal to j over ij plus I over ij, which now has the same denominator, and so I can add them, so I get that 1 over x equals j plus I over ij, and now I can cross multiply, okay? And so I'm going to take that up here, and I'm left with x times, and I'm going to not distribute on purpose here, the quantity I plus j. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to get x by itself, so I'm not going to complicate the matter by distributing it to something else. So x times the quantity I plus j is equal to ij. I then solve for x by dividing both sides by I plus j and get that x is equal to I times j divided by I plus j. Going ahead and evaluating this, I'm going to say that x is equal to I times j, so that's going to be 2 times 2 divided by I plus j, 2 plus 2, which happens to work out quite nicely here to being just equal to 1. Moving on to our next one, we have p equals 2 times the square root of x over L. So what I'm going to do is try and get that square root by itself on the right hand side by dividing both sides by 2. So I end up getting that p over 2 is equal to the square root of x over L. Okay, now to get rid of that square root, I'm simply going to square both sides, and I find that this is going to become then p squared over 4, okay? since it is two numbers divided, it's a fraction, I can go ahead and multiply or square the top and square the bottom. So that's going to be equal to x over L. To finish this off, you can either cross multiply or you can just multiply both sides by L, and then what you're going to be left with is L times P squared over 4 is equal to X. If we go ahead and evaluate that expression, I'm going to have that X is equal to L, which has a value of 10 times P squared, 4 squared, all over 4. And so I get here that X has a value of 40. Moving on to our last one here, A equals 1/2 bx squared. I'm going to start by multiplying both sides by 2 to get rid of that 1/2. So I get that 2a equals bx squared. My next step then is going to be to divide both sides by b to get rid of the b on this side, and so I find that x squared is going to be equal to 2a over b. Alright, and then my final step here is to take the square root of both sides. Okay, and when I do that, I get that x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 2a over b. And I actually forgot the plus or minus on the answer sheet that you were given, so I apologize for that. And so then when we go ahead and evaluate this, x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 2 times a, which has a value of 12 here, over b, which has a value of 4. And I get that x is equal to plus or minus 2.45.